The forest on Redwood Prime was quiet, unnaturally so. The towering crimson pines stood sentinel, their thick canopy filtering a dim, ruddy light that bathed the forest floor in shadows. The mercenaries moved silently through the undergrowth, their boots making no sound thanks to dampening fields woven into their armor. Their leader, a reptilian being with mottled green skin and a single golden eye, signaled for a halt. They crouched as one, their figures blending into the surrounding foliage. "Target is in the cabin ahead," the leader hissed, his voice barely audible. The cabin was an unassuming structure of weathered wood, nestled in a clearing and partially obscured by mist. It appeared abandoned at first glance, but the reports were clear. The retired human general, Alexander Smith, was here. To most of the galaxy, Smith was a name whispered in cautionary tales. A man who had turned battlefields into graveyards and rebel strongholds into ash. "He's just one man," a younger mercenary whispered, his voice betraying his nerves. "One man who turned the tide of the Blood Eclipse campaign," the leader snapped, his golden eye narrowing. "Don't underestimate him. That's why the Empire hired us." Inside the cabin, Alexander Smith stood at the window, his frame silhouetted against the dim light. His face was lined with age, though his piercing blue eyes carried the sharpness of someone who had seen and done far too much. His movements were deliberate as he poured a cup of tea, the steam rising in faint wisps. On the floor near him, Ajax, his cybernetic wolfhound, stirred. The sleek metallic creature raised its head, its glowing yellow eyes scanning the room. It emitted a low hum, a sound Smith had come to recognize as a warning. "You sense them too," he murmured, placing the cup down. Smith moved to a console embedded in the cabin's wall, activating a hidden screen that displayed a grainy feed from external sensors. The mercenaries were skilled, but not invisible. Smith counted 5 figures advancing through the trees, their movements methodical. His jaw tightened. He had left this life behind years ago, retreating to this isolated planet to escape the shadows of his past. But now, it seemed, the past had found him. Outside, the mercenaries reached the edge of the clearing. The leader raised a fist, signaling the team to fan out. Their weapons, sleek and lethal, were aimed at the cabin. The leader tapped a device on his wrist, and a holographic image of Smith appeared in the air. "Alexander Smith," the leader called out, his voice amplified by a vocal modulator. "By order of the Galactic Empire, you are to be terminated. Resist, and we will make this painful." Inside, Smith allowed himself a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. He moved to a cabinet, sliding open a hidden panel to reveal an array of weapons. His fingers brushed over the familiar cold metal of an ion rifle before he chose a smaller, more precise energy pistol. "You've had your piece, Alex," he muttered to himself. "Time to see if the galaxy still fears the Baba Yaga." The first shot came without warning. A mercenary at the edge of the clearing crumpled, a smoking hole where his helmet used to be. The others reacted instantly, diving for cover as energy bolts tore through the air. "Sniper," one of them shouted, though the shot had come from within the cabin. Smith moved with practiced efficiency, his years of training evident in the precision of every action. He fired again, his pistol humming with lethal energy. Another mercenary fell, and the leader barked orders, deploying drones that buzzed into the air and zipped toward the cabin. Ajax sprang to life, its metallic body moving in a blur. With a mechanical snarl, it leapt at a drone, its razor-sharp teeth shredding the device in seconds. The wolfhound darted back inside, its sensors scanning for more threats. The mercenaries regrouped, launching a coordinated assault. Explosive charges detonated near the cabin, shaking the ground and sending splinters flying. Smith used the chaos to reposition, his mind calculating every angle of attack. The leader advanced, his golden eye gleaming with determination. He signaled one of his men to flank the cabin, unaware of the trap Smith had laid. As the mercenary stepped onto the porch, a hidden mine detonated, sending a fiery shockwave through the clearing. "Fall back," The leader roared, realizing too late that the cabin was a death trap. Smith emerged, his figure wreathed in smoke. He moved like a predator, every shot finding its mark. The mercenaries, despite their training, were no match for his precision and strategy. Within minutes, only the leader remained. The reptilian mercenary dropped his weapon, raising his hands in surrender as Smith approached. Ajax growled, its metallic frame gleaming ominously in the dim light. "Who sent you?" Smith demanded, his voice cold. "The Empire," the mercenary rasped, his single eye flicking nervously between Smith and the wolfhound. "They see you as a threat. Said you know too much." Smith's jaw tightened. The Empire's reach was vast, and their fear of him spoke volumes. "Why now?" he pressed, but the mercenary only smiled, his sharp teeth bared. "You'll never stop them," the alien hissed. Then his body convulsed, and before Smith could react, a nanite bomb embedded in the mercenary's neck activated, disintegrating him in a flash of light and ash. The silence that followed was deafening. Smith lowered his weapon, his mind racing. The Empire's message was clear. They wanted him erased, and they were willing to go to any lengths to achieve it. Ajax padded over, its glowing eyes fixed on Smith. The general knelt, placing a hand on the wolfhound's head. "Looks like retirement's over," he muttered. As he stood, the forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard the hum of another approaching ship. The game had just begun. Alexander Smith sat on the edge of his cot, the room dimly lit by the amber glow of an old lamp. The cabin, though battered from the recent attack, was still standing, a testament to its reinforced structure and his meticulous preparations. Ajax rested near his feet, its metallic body emitting a faint hum as it entered a recharge cycle. The silence should have been comforting, but it felt oppressive, weighted by memories that refused to stay buried. Smith stared at the worn photograph in his hand, its edges frayed from years of handling. The image depicted a younger version of himself in a pristine military uniform, flanked by comrades long since gone. He traced a finger over the faces, his expression unreadable. The photo was a relic of a different time, one when he believed in the ideals of the Galactic Empire. That belief had cost him everything. He closed his eyes, and the past surged forward like a tidal wave. The Blood Eclipse Campaign. The name alone was enough to send shivers through anyone who had lived through it. It was a war waged on an industrial scale, entire planets razed in the name of imperial dominance. Smith had been the architect of many victories, his strategies turning the tide in battles deemed unwinnable. His soldiers had called him a hero, but he knew better. There was one mission in particular that haunted him. The Empire had identified a rebel stronghold on the planet Dracos 4, a lush world teeming with life. The rebels had hidden among the civilian population, making traditional warfare impossible. The Empire's solution had been ruthless. Carpet-bombed the entire region, erasing any potential threat. Smith had protested, arguing for precision strikes and targeted raids. But his superiors had overruled him. He had followed orders, and the result was catastrophic. Millions had perished, their cries of terror echoing in his mind even now. He had walked away from the Empire after that, disgusted by its disregard for life and its insatiable hunger for power. Retirement hadn't been an option. It had been a necessity. He had chosen Redwood Prime, a remote and unremarkable planet, as his sanctuary, believing he could live out the rest of his days in peace. But peace, it seemed, was a fleeting thing. The faint chime of an encrypted communication console drew him from his thoughts. Rising from the cot, Smith crossed the room and activated the device. The screen flickered to life, displaying a coded message. He decrypted it with practiced ease, his brow furrowing as he read the contents. The Empire had placed a bounty on his head, a sum so large it would attract every mercenary, assassin, and bounty hunter in the galaxy. The message also revealed the Empire's reasoning. Smith wasn't just a liability. He was a symbol. His defection had planted seeds of doubt among the military ranks, and his survival served as a reminder that even the most loyal could turn against their masters. "They're scared of you," a voice said. Smith turned sharply, his weapon drawn, but it was only Jonah Vance, the young bounty hunter he had saved during the earlier skirmish. Jonah leaned against the doorway, his arm in a makeshift sling, and a faint smirk on his face. "You shouldn't sneak up on people," Smith said, lowering the weapon. "Didn't mean to," Jonah replied, stepping into the room. "Figured you'd be busy planning how to kill the next wave." Smith regarded him for a moment. Jonah was scruffy and wiry, with the cocky air of someone who had survived more by luck than skill. Yet there was something in his eyes, a glimmer of determination that reminded Smith of himself at a younger age. "You should leave," Smith said bluntly. "The longer you stay, the more danger you're in." Jonah shook his head. "Not happening. Those mercs left me for dead. I owe them payback. Besides, I've got intel you might want." Smith raised an eyebrow but said nothing, motioning for Jonah to continue. "The Empire isn't just after you because of your past," Jonah said, pulling a data chip from his pocket. "They're testing a new weapon, a planetary orbital strike system. They call it Erebus. If they can't kill you with mercenaries, they'll use that. Redwood Prime will be the first target." Smith took the chip, inserting it into the console. The data displayed schematics and operational details of the weapon. Erebus was a monstrosity, capable of obliterating a planet's surface in minutes. The Empire's desperation was clear. They weren't just trying to eliminate him. They wanted to make an example. "This changes things," Smith muttered. "You're telling me," Jonah replied. "But it's not just about you anymore. If they deploy that weapon here, they'll use it on anyone who defies them. The rebels, neutral worlds, maybe even their own colonies. It's a message." Smith nodded, his mind racing. He had hoped to avoid war, but the Empire had left him no choice. He couldn't stay hidden, not when the stakes were this high. He opened a concealed panel in the wall, revealing an arsenal of weapons and equipment. Jonah let out a low whistle, impressed by the array of firepower. "Plan?" Jonah asked, his tone eager. Smith began selecting weapons, strapping them to his body with practiced efficiency. "First, we fortify," Smith said. "This cabin is defensible, but not invulnerable. We'll need to set traps, secure escape routes, and create diversions." Jonah nodded, already grabbing supplies. "And after that," Smith's expression hardened. "After that, we take the fight to them. If the Empire wants me, they'll have to pay for it in blood." Ajax stirred, its yellow eyes glowing as it stood, and trotted to Smith's side. The wolfhound's presence was reassuring, a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone. As the two men worked to prepare, the cabin buzzed with activity. Every movement, every decision was calculated. Smith's mind was a whirlwind of strategies and contingencies, his years of experience coming to the forefront. He couldn't undo the past, but he could ensure the future wouldn't be dictated by the Empire's tyranny. The night deepened, the forest outside growing darker and more foreboding. Smith paused for a moment, staring out the window at the endless expanse of trees. He knew the battle ahead would be brutal, perhaps even his last. But if this was how his story ended, he would make sure it was a story worth telling. Behind him, Jonah spoke, his voice cutting through the silence. "You really think we can win this?" Smith turned, his expression grim but resolute. "It's not about winning. It's about making them regret ever starting this." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The stage was set, the pieces in motion. The Empire had underestimated him once, and it would cost them dearly. The metallic hum of approaching ships broke the fragile silence of the forest. Smith stood at the edge of the clearing, his weapon gripped tightly, his eyes scanning the sky. Through the canopy of crimson pines, flashes of movement hinted at the arrival of a new threat. Jonah crouched nearby, his blaster rifle cradled in his arms, his face set in a mixture of fear and resolve. "They're here," Jonah muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Smith didn't respond. His focus was on the tactical display projected on his wrist. Drones, small and agile, were sweeping the area ahead of the main force, their presence confirmed by faint pings on the scanner. They were looking for him, and they wouldn't stop until they found him. "Take position," Smith ordered, his voice calm but commanding. Jonah nodded and moved to a nearby ridge, using the natural cover to conceal himself. Ajax followed Smith, the wolfhound's body low to the ground, its glowing eyes scanning for threats. They had prepared for this moment, laying traps and creating ambush points, but Smith knew the enemy wouldn't make it easy. The first sign of the hunters came in the form of a low, throbbing sound. From the shadows, figures emerged, their movements precise and deliberate. They were heavily armed, their armor gleaming with a dull, alien sheen. At their center was Chris Thorne, a tall, imposing man with a shaven head and eyes like chips of ice. Unlike the mercenaries before, Chris moved with the confidence of someone who had survived countless battles. "Fan out," Chris ordered, his voice carrying authority. His team obeyed without hesitation, spreading into the forest and scanning their surroundings with advanced visors. Chris's reputation as a hunter was legendary, his methods brutal and efficient. Smith watched from the shadows, his mind already working to outmaneuver him. The first trap was triggered moments later. A hidden proximity mine erupted, sending a plume of fire and shrapnel into the air. One of Chris's men screamed as he was caught in the blast, his body crumpling to the ground. The others reacted immediately, taking cover and scanning for the source of the attack. Smith used the chaos to strike, emerging from cover to fire a single, precise shot. Another mercenary fell, and Ajax darted forward, its metallic form moving with lethal grace. The wolfhound leaped onto a drone, tearing it apart before retreating into the underbrush. Chris didn't flinch. Instead, he smirked, a predator recognizing the challenge before him. "Impressive," he muttered, "but I've dealt with legends before." He tapped the control on his wrist, deploying a swarm of micro-drones that fanned out into the forest. They moved quickly, their sensors searching for heat signatures and motion. Smith cursed under his breath, recognizing the threat they posed. From his vantage point, Jonah saw the drones approaching. He fired, taking out one, then another, but the swarm adjusted, converging on his position. "They're on me," Jonah shouted through the comm. "Hold your ground," Smith replied. "Stick to the plan." Jonah swallowed his fear and did as instructed, retreating to a secondary position while laying suppressive fire. The drones pursued, but another of Smith's traps, a hidden EMP device, activated, sending a pulse that fried their circuits. The forest grew quiet again, but only for a moment. Chris's voice cut through the comms, directed at Smith. "You're good, General. I'll give you that. But this ends one way. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time." Smith didn't respond. Words were a distraction he couldn't afford. Instead, he moved to flank Chris's position, using the terrain to his advantage. Ajax stayed close, its sensors tuned to detect any threats. Chris, meanwhile, was orchestrating his team with precision. He directed his men to sweep the area methodically, tightening the noose around Smith. Despite their losses, they moved with discipline, their weapons at the ready. Smith made his next move, targeting a cluster of mercenaries near a rock outcropping. He threw a grenade, its explosion scattering the group and sowing confusion. Emerging from cover, he picked off two more with rapid, controlled shots. Chris turned toward the sound of gunfire, his expression darkening. "Enough of this," he growled. He activated a personal shield and advanced toward Smith's position, his weapon firing bursts of plasma that scorched the trees. Smith ducked behind a fallen log, narrowly avoiding the deadly projectiles. Ajax lunged at Chris, its claws slashing against the shield, but the hunter countered with a powerful strike, sending the wolfhound tumbling. "Persistent, aren't you?" Chris sneered. Ajax recovered quickly, retreating to Smith's side. The general assessed the situation, his mind calculating the next move. Chris was skilled, but arrogance was his weakness. Smith decided to exploit it. Using the terrain, Smith led Chris deeper into the forest, away from his remaining men. The hunter followed, his shield absorbing stray shots as he closed the distance. When Chris finally reached him, Smith was ready. The fight was brutal and personal. Chris's strikes were powerful, but Smith's experience and precision gave him the edge. He used Chris's momentum against him, delivering calculated blows that wore the hunter down. Finally, with a well-timed move, Smith disarmed him and pinned him to the ground. "Who sent you?" Smith demanded, his voice icy. Chris smirked through bloodied lips. "You already know, but it won't matter. They'll keep coming, and you can't fight them all." Smith stared at him, his grip tightening. He wanted to end it, to remove one more threat from his path, but a distant explosion cut through the moment. Jonah's voice crackled through the calm. "General, reinforcements just landed. A lot of them." Smith released Chris, stepping back. "You're right," Smith said coldly. "I can't fight them all, but I can make them regret coming for me." Chris laughed weakly. "Good luck with that." Smith turned and disappeared into the shadows, Ajax close behind. The forest was alive with the sound of approaching troops, their numbers overwhelming. But Smith wasn't finished yet. As he regrouped with Jonah, the young bounty hunter looked at him expectantly. "What now?" Jonah asked. Smith's eyes hardened, the fire of determination burning within them. "Now," he said, "we make them wish they'd never set foot on this planet." The night deepened, the forest brimming with tension. The hunt was far from over, and the Empire would soon learn the true cost of underestimating Alexander Smith. The air was electric with tension as the first rays of dawn pierced through the dense canopy of crimson pines. The Empire's reinforcements had established a perimeter around the clearing, their movements precise and mechanical. Soldiers, drones, and towering mechs stood ready, their weapons trained on the forest, anticipating any movement. From the high ground, Smith surveyed the scene through a pair of binoculars, his expression grim but resolute. "They brought half an army," Jonah muttered, crouched beside him. He sounded awed and terrified. Smith lowered the binoculars and adjusted the strap of his rifle. "They think numbers win wars," he said. "But they're wrong. Wars are won by strategy." Jonah gave him a sidelong glance. "Please tell me you've got a strategy." Smith didn't answer. Instead, he activated his wrist console, bringing up a map of the area. The traps he and Jonah had spent the night setting up were highlighted in bright red. Mines, EMP charges, and ambush points. "They'll come at us hard," Smith said. "We give them nothing but chaos in return. Stick to the plan, no matter what happens." Jonah swallowed hard and nodded. "Got it." The first shot came from the Empire. A drone, sleek and silent, darted into the trees, its sensors scanning for heat signatures. Smith waited until it was directly overhead before activating a remote charge. The explosion shattered the quiet, the drone's wreckage raining down like blackened snow. The soldiers reacted immediately, advancing in disciplined formation. But the forest was a maze of traps, each step a gamble. Mines detonated underfoot, sending shockwaves through the ranks. EMP bursts disabled their equipment, leaving them vulnerable to ambushes. From his position, Smith picked off soldiers with surgical precision, each shot calculated to maximize confusion. Jonah, positioned on a ridge, provided cover fire. His aim was shaky at first, but with each successful hit, his confidence grew. "They're regrouping," Jonah called out over the comm. Smith adjusted his position, keeping a close eye on the advancing forces. The mechs were moving now, their towering frames crashing through the underbrush. Their heavy armor made them impervious to small arms fire, and their mounted cannons leveled everything in their path. "Ajax now!" Smith commanded. The wolfhound leaped into action, darting between the mech's legs with uncanny agility. It carried an explosive charge, which it attached to one of the mech's joints before retreating. The explosion crippled the machine, sending it toppling into the ranks of soldiers below. Chris Thorne emerged from the chaos, his armor battered but intact. He barked orders to his men, rallying them with a mix of threats and charisma. Smith watched him through the scope of his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. But Chris was no fool. He kept moving, making it impossible to get a clean shot. The battle raged on, the forest becoming a battlefield of smoke and fire. Smith and Jonah moved like ghosts, striking and retreating before the Empire could retaliate. But the enemy's numbers were relentless, and the traps were running out. "They're closing in," Jonah shouted. Smith could see it, too. The Empire's forces were adapting, their disciplined training overcoming the confusion of the ambush. The perimeter was tightening, and soon there would be no room to maneuver. "Fall back to the cabin," Smith ordered. They retreated through the trees, Ajax covering their escape with bursts of suppressive fire. When they reached the cabin, Smith activated its final defenses. Automated turrets emerged from concealed panels, their barrels spinning to life. The cabin itself was reinforced with layers of armor, turning it into a fortress. The Empire's forces arrived moments later, their assault immediate and overwhelming. Plasma bolts and explosives rained down on the cabin, but the structure held firm. The turrets cut through the ranks, buying Smith and Jonah precious time. Inside, Jonah was pale and sweating, his hands shaking as he reloaded his weapon. "We can't hold them off forever." Smith placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "We don't have to, just long enough to end this." He pulled up a holographic display, showing the orbital weapon Erebus, in its geostationary position above the planet. Smith had spent the night hacking into its systems, planting a virus that would override its targeting protocols. "What are you doing?" Jonah asked, watching as Smith worked. "Turning their weapon against them," Smith replied. The virus took hold, and Erebus's systems began to respond. The orbital platform's targeting array shifted, locking onto the forest below. "You're going to destroy them," Jonah said, realization dawning on him. Smith nodded. "And us, if necessary. The Empire can't have this weapon." The cabin shook as a mech fired a direct hit, breaching one of the walls. Chris Thorne strode in through the smoke, his weapon trained on Smith. "End of the line, General," Chris said, his voice cold. Smith didn't flinch. "You're too late." Chris hesitated, his gaze flicking to the holographic display. Realizing what Smith had done, his eyes widened. "You're insane," Chris growled. Smith smirked. "Takes one to know one." Ajax lunged at Chris, distracting him long enough for Smith to grab his weapon. The two men clashed in a brutal fight, trading blows with lethal intent. Chris was strong, but Smith fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. Finally, with a swift move, Smith disarmed Chris and sent him crashing to the ground. "Goodbye, Thorne," Smith said, his voice cold as he delivered the final blow. Outside, the Empire's forces were in full retreat, realizing too late what was about to happen. Smith activated the final command, and Erebus fired. A beam of energy lanced through the atmosphere, striking the forest with blinding intensity. The ground shook, and the air turned to fire. Smith and Jonah barely made it into the cabin's reinforced safe room as the world outside was consumed in light. When the dust settled, the forest was a smoldering wasteland, the Empire's forces obliterated. The cabin, though damaged, still stood, a testament to its resilience. Jonah sat in stunned silence, staring at the devastation outside. "We survived," he said, disbelief in his voice. "For now," Smith replied, his tone grim. "But this isn't over. The Empire will send more." Jonah looked at him, a mixture of fear and respect in his eyes. "What do we do?" Smith stared at the horizon, his expression unreadable. "We fight, until they have nothing left to send." Ajax trotted to his side, its yellow eyes glowing in the dim light. Together, they stood as the sun rose over the ruined landscape, the battle won but the war far from over.